Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I am Kristen Welker in Washington. You've been watching our breaking news coverage of the historic summit between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin as the two leaders meet for discussions about the path towards ending the war in Ukraine. Right now, the two leaders are continuing to meet behind closed doors. But this was the scene just moments ago. Take a look. It was supposed to be a one-on-one meeting just President Trump and President Putin. But you can see here Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff there right alongside President Trump. President Putin also there with top officials. Both leaders ignoring shouted questions largely from reporters. They are expected to hold an expanded working lunch with their larger delegations before a potential joint news conference. President Trump has said he plans to call President Zelensky immediately after this meeting wraps. The Ukrainian president was not invited to this summit. While the two leaders didn't meet formally one-on-one, they did share a private moment, President Trump greeting President Putin with some pomp, which included a U.S. military flyover. The Trump administration rolling out the figurative and literal red carpet for the Russian leader, flanked by F-22 fighter jets. The two leaders then got into the Beast, that's the president's car, together to head over to the meeting location. You could see Putin even laughing there as the two drove away. In an interview with Fox News on Air Force One on his way to Alaska, President Trump laid out his expectations, even signaling he could walk away from these talks.
I'd like to see a ceasefire. I wouldn't be thrilled if I didn't get it, but everyone says you're not going to get the ceasefire. It'll take place on the second meeting. The second meeting is going to be but I'm not going to be happy with that. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to be, I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire.
Joining me now, our team of reporters to start us off. NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake is in Anchorage, Alaska. NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons is in London. And with me right here on set is NBC News chief Washington correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell and Evelyn Farkas, executive director of the McCain Institute and former assistant secretary of defense for Russia and Ukraine. Thanks to all of you for being here and starting us off. Garrett, I have to start with you in Anchorage, Alaska. You were there when President Trump, when President Putin arrived. We saw that extraordinary made-for-TV moment when the two leaders greeted each other on the red carpet. So far, Garrett, what have been your biggest takeaways?
Well, look, the president has avoided for so long setting expectations for this summit, but now it feels like we're in a situation where he probably owns this conflict and these negotiations much more than he perhaps intended or certainly did before this moment. For 207 days, he's pushed down the line what has been a campaign promise to end this war on day one. But now, given this pomp and circumstance, the B-2 flyover, the handshakes, the private ride in the Beast, something that's not done often with close allies, let alone an adversary on the scale of Russia, the president has involved himself so much further in this conflict that I think whatever we see today is going to take on greater import. You know, on that same conversation on Air Force One, the president talked about severe economic consequences. He was pressed about the idea of a peacekeeping force of some kind in Ukraine. The stakes are only going to rise, I think, from this moment onward as we get through this evening and whatever happens next, especially if there is this second meeting, which has been probably the only goalpost that the White House has been willing to stick to over the last couple of days for judging success in what happens here today in Alaska.
Garrett, you and I have talked so much about how the president's tone, expectation setting has changed in recent weeks, in recent days, in terms of the way he's talked about Vladimir Putin several weeks ago, saying he was disappointed, now shifting his tone, saying he thinks he does, in fact, want peace, setting the expectation, saying he wants a ceasefire agreement, but also saying the only real progress is going to come in a second follow-up meeting. What do you make of the fact that his language, his tone, to some extent, has shifted so much?
There's a couple of things going on here. I mean, the president has clearly both publicly and privately been frustrated with Vladimir Putin, who is essentially on his own, keeping the president from fulfilling one of his key campaign promises, which was to bring this war to a close on day one. As I said, we're more than 200 days past that. And so we saw him shift his focus of frustration with Zelensky to frustration with Putin. I think today you're seeing a president who, we talk about his reality TV career, but also had a career in hospitality. He wants to be warm. He wants these other foreign leaders to like him. He wants to create that personal relationship from which he can then strike a deal. And so how he moved forward here, I think, is going to be very fascinating to watch. Does he continue with that frustration with Putin? Is he willing to involve the Europeans more? And how do they get to that second meeting? Look, the president has inserted himself very far into this conflict, and the prospect of being the one to bring it to a close is something that I think appeals to him a great deal personally, securing his place in history. It's the kind of thing that he does care about on a personal level. Can he bring it across the finish line, or is this another thing that's going to get delayed and pushed out with these ever-shifting goalposts? We're just going to find out in real time.
You're absolutely right. This is all evolving in real time, Garrett, and we saw there another evolution. The fact that this went from an initial meeting that was supposed to be President Trump and President Putin, and now they're joined by two top officials. For President Trump's part, by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff. It was Steve Witkoff who had the meeting with President Putin that led to this meeting with President Trump. Talk about the relationship and the significance of those two men being in the room.
Yeah, these are important figures, but for different reasons. Witkoff, like Trump, comes in without a traditional background in diplomacy or in foreign policy, but he has someone who has the implicit trust of the president. They have been friends for decades. Witkoff has told me he thinks of himself as Donald Trump's best friend. He's a gut check for the president and someone whose opinion he will value and trust above those of many other people, perhaps even including the man sitting to the president's immediate left, Marco Rubio, his national security advisor and Secretary of State. Rubio's value in the president's eyes has only increased since Rubio joined his administration. But Rubio, remember, started with much more traditional views on foreign policy, much more of a traditional Russia hawk. He's someone who's described Vladimir Putin as a butcher and someone who I think will be more naturally distrustful of the Russian position. So you could have something of a good cop, bad cop situation here with Rubio and Witkoff as the two people in the room. But they are people whose opinions ultimately, after this meeting wraps, whenever that is, whom the president will actually value their opinions above those of many of his other aides.
Yeah, great reporting and analysis. And Garrett, Haake, we continue to watch it all unfold in real time together. Thank you for starting us off. Keir, let me turn to you now. Those extraordinary images, the warm greeting between President Trump and President Putin chuckling in the beast. A former Republican U.S. official telling me, boy, Putin's having a strong first inning. What are European officials making of these initial images? What's the response been so far?
Well, stunned silence, honestly. European officials, European leaders, Ukrainians will be watching with their hearts in their mouth, frankly. And that isn't to say that necessarily how this begins is how this ends, this summit. So there's many hours to go. But certainly, that moment, President Putin sitting in the beast, smiling and laughing, looking out the window, and just think about that he will have been aware there were photographers there. He's looking out the window as he laughs. He is somebody who understands the choreography of these kinds of things just as much as President Trump does. That is an image that will echo through history, given how many people have died and have been wounded as a result of President Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. The question of how that came about is still hanging, Kristen. So we are reading Russian journalists who are saying that there was a car for President Putin on the tarmac waiting for him. That it's not confirmed that it wasn't. That it was the case that President Putin necessarily, in the end, intended to get in that car. But one of our Russia experts, one of our producers, has looked at the video and can see Russian plates on the car, can see that Russian presidential car there. So how was it that President Putin ended up in the vehicle with President Trump? I'm dwelling on this because it's the opening moments, the opening minutes after 6 years of the two men being together, because they appear to have been in the vehicle, perhaps without translators, certainly perhaps without note takers. And in the past, during the first Trump administration, moments when President Trump was with President Putin on their own, maybe just with a Russian interpreter, interpreter. Those moments have been incredibly controversial. And I'll just tell you this too. I have spoken with President Putin in English, not on camera, in the past, on some occasions. He has English. It is stilted. There is video of President Putin speaking in English during the run-up to the World Cup held in Russia, for example, or at Buckingham Palace. This is a long time ago now, making a speech in front of the Queen. But from my experience, President Putin's English is not fluent, so it will have been, maybe it just will have been niceties. Who knows? And in a sense, that is the point. Are we going to know what these two men said to each other in the opening moments of this absolutely crucial summit?
That is the point, because it effectively became a small bilateral meeting in and of itself in the back of the Beast, the presidential vehicle. Keir, stand by for me. I want to go now to Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, can you put those stunning optics into perspective? As Keir said, they are worth focusing on because these are the opening moments of this historic summit. And you saw Putin with that big grin. Certainly European allies watching very closely.
European allies and Vladimir Zelensky and all of the mothers and fathers and spouses in Ukraine. Richard Engel reporting so memorably and compassionately yesterday on a funeral in Ukraine of a young soldier and the mother sobbing over the grave and the long line of blue and gold, blue and yellow flags waiting for the next coffin to be lowered. Just to say, you and I were in Helsinki. We sat next to each other and we watched that unfold. The opening moments, like the opening moments in Helsinki when the two men stood next to each other and were the camaraderie was palpable, and there was the validation in words of the Putin lies about the interference, the attempted interference in 2016, which the President of the United States accepted and invalidated his own intelligence agencies. So these things are so important. I had a flashback when I was thinking about today and watching that unfold, thinking about the Russian and Ukraine experts, the analysts, at the NSC, at the State Department, who no longer work there after the DOGE cutbacks and the rifts. The desks have been decimated, and to a certain extent, those also at the CIA. The people who did not go into planning, as one of our colleagues here, Evelyn Farkas, knows from her days at the Pentagon, the planning of a summit beforehand. What do you do if this happens? And I had a flashback to 1985 in Geneva, when the first meeting between an American president and a Soviet leader, Gorbachev and Reagan, and I'm standing there in the cold in Geneva watching Ronald Reagan. He had arrived earlier, in the Beast and had an overcoat on, but when he came down those steps to meet 25-year younger man, Gorbachev in his 50s, Ronald Reagan was in a suit, and Gorbachev came out wearing a coat and a muffler and a hat. And that was a very careful, deliberate decision by the advisors to make the older man look younger and the younger man look older. And they also did that walkabout down to, down around by themselves. And that was the one-on-one that sealed the relationship. So these are important moments.
They're important moments. And Evelyn, boy, Andrea captures so
great.
well the history and the extent to which these moments are usually so carefully choreographed. We know that, yes, there was this red carpet rollout, but we know that things are also shifting around in real time, like the fact that there are now two top advisors with each of these leaders in this initial bilateral. And just as of last night, I spoke with a U.S. official who said they are still planning a number of things. So what do you make of what we have witnessed so far and what's unfolded so far in Alaska?
I mean, I feel like I have a split screen, in my brain, because on the one hand, based on what Andrea said and understanding diplomacy, you have to show respect to a leader that you're negotiating with, right? So President Trump is doing that, and he's trying to establish some kind of camaraderie rather than coming down hard. He's always said, I want to make sure that I can maintain a line of communication with Vladimir Putin. He wants to be different, although it's not that different from other presidents who have tried this. On the other hand, I think to myself, my God, this is a war criminal. This is a guy who has a warrant out for his arrest by the International Criminal Court. The only reason we didn't arrest him is because we're not party to that treaty. But he has, murdered not only Ukrainians, but every day there are about 1,000+ Russians dying or getting injured on the battlefield because of this man. He's kidnapped. Of course, that's why he has the indictment. So I can go on and on. He's a war criminal. So the other part of me is, why do we have to roll out the red carpet for a war criminal? Why can't we just have him come inside the base and just do it in an austere kind of, tent or military building?
Keir, you'd have to imagine as President Zelensky watches this unfold that those are some of the questions he is asking. He, of course, was not invited to this summit. It's our understanding that President Trump wanted to have him at the summit, and yet President Putin wouldn't agree to that. So you have heard President Trump consistently throughout the course of this week put the focus on the next meeting that will include, he says, President Zelensky. Do you believe that if this meeting goes well, that President Zelensky will be ready to get on a plane, whether it be in the next several hours or several days?
Well, I would make one point that the actual meeting itself turned out to be 6 officials. So you had President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio and Ambassador, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, on the one side, and then you had President Putin and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and a very senior Russian diplomat, Yuri Ushakov, on the other side. There are, on both sides, economic advisors, trade advisors. They weren't in that room. So does that mean then that the opening conversation is about Ukraine and is about a ceasefire and is about the kinds of things that the Ukrainians and the Europeans have said should be at the heart of this before you start to talk about anything else? Another point I think is worth noting, Kristen, is that just think back to the extraordinary optics in the Trump first term of President Trump with Kim Jong-un. And how much bonhomie there was there and how history-making those images were. And then President Trump walked away. And so I think, and I'll tell you, from speaking to Russian officials, they know this very, very well. President Trump is unpredictable. We know that. So we should just note that in the past, extraordinary images like these at the beginning of a summit have not meant that the summit went well, not necessarily with President Trump.
Keir, it's such an important point that you bring up, and I'm glad that you bring it up because, Andrea, we have heard President Trump say he will know within the first few minutes of meeting President Putin whether he's serious about this initial ceasefire agreement that President Trump wants to get, if he's serious about a longer peace deal. And you do have to think back to that moment when President Trump did walk away from Kim Jong-un. He held that solo news conference and said he wasn't ready to make a deal. Unpredictability is part of how President Trump governs, and he would argue it's part of how he gets deals done.
The difference here, though, is that President Trump does not know the details of Ukraine, whether, what villages, what, cities, what the military situation is. And even to be discussing territorial swaps is really concerning to the Ukrainians and the Europeans because Putin is a master of this. He is the former KGB commander, the former KGB leader in East Germany. He has studied this. This land is the land that he wants to be part of the Soviet Union, the expanded Russia, and restore it the way the shirt or T-shirt or whatever it was that Lavrov, the wily foreign minister, was wearing today to indicate the CCCP. That is such a throwback and such an important signal. So that was a trolling of the U.S. side as well, and of certainly the Ukrainian and the Europeans.
And in a moment that is so high stakes, we pay attention to every single detail. And the fact that Sergei Lavrov would show up with that shirt on, Evelyn, Farkas, so many people took note of that, essentially sending a signal, reminding people of the USSR. Andrea makes the point about the discussion of land swaps. President Trump talked about it this week. It set off alarm bells for European officials. He then had a call with European leaders, with President Zelensky. He promised them, based on our reporting, that he would not negotiate territory without President Zelensky in the room. But the question is, and I think this is what Andrea's gotten to, when you talk about President Putin as a negotiator going into one of these rooms, he's a former KGB officer. He knows how to throw people off of their intended strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Putin will try to get his maximalist aims. You know, he'll demand, as he always has, those two provinces. He will demand that Ukraine cannot join NATO and that there can be no NATO forces to enforce any kind of future agreement. I think, however, if he can't distract President Trump by talking about arms control or future business deals, because I can imagine on the tarmac he might have said, we'll make a deal, let's talk business, you know, and President Trump would smile and laugh at that. And I would imagine that President Putin would try to distract him with that. But if he can't, if President Trump is adamant that we have to have some agreement today on Ukraine, I think he'll probably agree to a ceasefire, but I'm here to tell you that he will also break it. He will break it if we don't continue, if President Trump doesn't continue the pressure, military pressure and economic.
Andrea, you have covered so many ceasefire agreements. We've talked so much about a ceasefire. To Evelyn's point, ceasefires are historically very tentative and tenuous and fragile.
And we see that every day in the Middle East. We see that tragically all over the world. Here, it is really a warning signal because people in Ukraine, for good reason, do not trust a Putin ceasefire. He took Crimea in 2014, and there was no pushback. And that's not on Donald Trump. But the fact is that bit by bit, and Zelensky in last summer's incursion into Kursk, the first incursion into Russian territory, thought it would give him some leverage at a future negotiation. But they've lost most of that territory already. I mean, Russia has been on the offensive every day, and his intentions about a ceasefire could have been signaled if they were positive, constructive intentions going into these talks, if he had not been advancing as aggressively, as brutally as they have been for the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, and Keir, let me quickly, we do have sound of President Trump talking about these land swaps. I want to play it a little bit and get your reaction on the other side. This is from Air Force One today.
Are the territorial swaps on the table? Will you be discussing that?
Yeah, they'll be discussed, but I've got to let Ukraine make that decision. And I think they'll make a proper decision. But I'm not here to negotiate for Ukraine. I'm here to get them at a table. And I think you have two sides. Look, Vladimir Putin wanted to take all of Ukraine. If I wasn't president, he would right now be taking all of Ukraine.
Keir, what do you make of his latest comments about the territory in Ukraine that Russia has illegally claimed?
Well, fact check. Vladimir Putin did want to take all of Ukraine, but it isn't because President Trump is president that he hasn't taken all of Ukraine in recent months. He hasn't been able to. Russia has been throwing blood and treasure at the front line and has been inching forward, as Andrea says, but only inching forward, honestly. I do think that President Putin believes that the Ukrainian front line could collapse. He's very likely wrong about, you never know in war, he's very likely wrong about that. But that, I suspect, will be driving him. Another point here, there has been confusion over exactly what the territory possibilities were. So some great reporting in the Wall Street Journal suggesting that it wasn't clear to the Europeans what the Russians said about Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, whether the Russians suggested that they would withdraw there, or whether, in fact, that wasn't part of an offer that was kind of privately made to Steve Witkoff in order to get this this meeting to happen. And that's one of the reasons why, actually, we should be welcoming seeing the Secretary of State and Steve Witkoff in that room with President Trump up against, if you like, three Russians, President Putin and two others who have, just as Andrea pointed out, just have so much experience. So that there's that piece. Another piece too. The Russians have been signalling some questions about where this goes. So Yuri Ushakov, the senior diplomat who's in that room with President Putin and President Trump right now, was asked by a Russian reporter whether there'll be another meeting, and he dismissed that and said, well, let's just get through this meeting first. So I think the Russians are going to themselves take a litmus test of what they can get from this. But here's the point, and you've made it very well. They've already got so much, haven't they, just from the optics of this, even if they walk away with no deal.
It's such a profound point, Keir, for you to make and highlight. And Evelyn, it speaks to this broader question. What does each side want? President Trump has said what he wants. He wants a ceasefire agreement. He wants another meeting. Does Russia want the same? Or is President Putin simply there to turn down the temperature with the U.S. to try to get some sanctions removed, to try to get a new nuclear START agreement?
President Putin is there to stall for time, Kristen. So I love Keir's description, because they're just, and Andrea said as well, just inching forward. But I think that Putin may well be told by his generals and his intelligence officers that they do have a chance to break through. In any event, he thinks time is on his side. Time suddenly wasn't on his side when President Trump seemed like he was getting impatient and he was going to put these secondary sanctions on him. So he said, hey, why don't we meet? This is a stalling tactic. And a ceasefire, unfortunately, without additional pressure and, frankly, really on the battlefield. The sanctions don't matter as much as sending arms to Ukraine, putting pressure on. Ukraine is hitting refineries. Ukraine is holding its ground. We could do a lot more to help them and put pressure on Putin.
Andrea, final point as we wrap up this initial segment.
Well, is the point of sanctions, again, today, the president on Air Force One flying out was asked, what would be the severe consequences if you don't think that Putin is serious about peace and a ceasefire? And he said, extremely severe, economic. Well, that's the secondary sanctions, but there are so many other reasons why those are complicated, especially against China. The president is trying to maintain a relationship with China. He has twice delayed his 90-day deadline for even putting tariffs, bilateral tariffs on China, because of those minerals, the minerals that the U.S. needs for batteries, for electric vehicles, and all sorts of equipment. The president has given an exemption to NVIDIA to sell chips to China. So he has done a lot of things that signal that he's not looking for a confrontation with China, and to crack down on China buying Russian oil, and India, to a lesser extent Brazil, which is already tariffed to death. It's a big step. They've already opposed unfreezing the Russian assets, $300 billion that could be unfrozen to rebuild Ukraine. There's a lot of steps that he could have taken so far.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And that is why this moment, as we watch and wait to see what happens with the threat of potentially some more actions, we'll see how it all unfolds. Evelyn, Andrea, thank you. And Keir, thank you so much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or watch live on our YouTube channel.